So, on one trip to Israel, we were given the opportunity to tour a very ultra Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. It's called Maya Sharim. And when you're in Maya Sharim, hold on. When you're in Maya Sharim, it's very clear who belongs there and who doesn't, because their way of dress and the way that their lifestyle is so completely different than the rest of us. It's very clear. If you drive through parts of Ohio or Pennsylvania, you run into some of the Amish folks where families basically are doing the same thing. For the Jewish people, they were trying to live consistently with the law of Moses, and the Amish people are trying to live consistently a lifestyle consistent with their faith, which impacts the way they drive their car or their vehicles, not their cars, their wagons, or the clothes that they wear, and those kinds of things. Their faith demands that they live in separate ways that ends up causing them to be clearly separate and unique from everybody else. The Bible word for that, we talked about this earlier, is the word for holy. And they are different, they are unique from the rest of the world. And again, the word doesn't mean a spiritual state, it means a status that is unique, set apart, or different from the rest of the world. It is their hope that somehow by living in this physical state of separateness and uniqueness, that it will also lead to a spiritual state of holiness as well. God is holy, and because there is none like him, sorry, he is the creator, he is a power in all different ways. God, there's none like him, right? And so that's what makes him holy, in addition to the fact that he is morally pure, which is what we usually associate holiness with. We are called to be holy like God. First Peter chapter 1, verse 15, 16 says, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you are to be holy, for I am holy. Is that the Jews finally understood that the Jews finally understood that they were called to be a holy and unique people when they finally got kicked out of the land that was meant to be their holy land, their set apart land. And when they got kicked out of it, they realized that they hadn't been living up to their part of the contract. And so while they're in Babylon, they begin to try and live according to that separateness, that holiness. And so it's while they're in Babylon that we start seeing things like the Pharisees set in, because people become very legalistic about following the rules of what it means to be there. The Jews are already holy or separate by the fact that in that day and age, they were the only monotheistic religion in the world. So strange was that to the rest of the world that the rest of the world considered them atheists because they said it killed all the other gods. There's all one other God. They were holy and separate because they circumcised their boys, they kept the Sabbath, they had kosher eating laws. When I look at what it means to be a Christ follower, what are the things that set us apart as holy and unique? Our monotheism, we could say yes, but monotheism dominates the world now with Islam and Judaism. There's 55% of the world that claims to be monotheistic. Sabbath keeping, most of us don't keep Sabbath anymore. The divorce rates are about the same. We dress like the rest of the world for the most part. Our language, the words that we use, stuff like that. So what sets us apart, and what are the signs that God intended to be the thing that sets us apart as holy and separate? That's where we get back into the book of Daniel. So if you have your digital or paper or otherwise, you follow along with the version. Daniel, again, and many other Judean artisans, royals, especially the royal family, were taken into exile. It happened first to the northern kingdom as they were captured by the Assyrian Empire. 10 tribes that had split away from the Davidic dynasty were taken into captivity in 722 BC by the kingdom of Assyria. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted about 150 years longer before they were taken into captivity. There was only two kingdoms, mainly the kingdom of Judah, that was tribe that was down in the south. They in that 150 years, had some success, lots of failure at keeping consistent with uh, the covenant they were supposed to keep with God. They kept slipping into rebellion. God kept sending prophets to warn them. Finally, in 612 BC, Babylon, who had already conquered the Assyrian Empire, now comes after Judah as well. Babylon becomes the poster child of an evil government. The Assyrians were not much better, but they become the very thing you think of when you think of an evil empire. Babylon is mentioned over 300 times in Scripture as an evil place, including being called the mother of all harlots. So, as he is attacked, and now this first time the book opens at the first attack, 605, 606 BC, and those attacks are going to last for another 30 years until they finally just wipe out the kingdom of Judah completely and take everybody. But we covered in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, Yahweh gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And that unthinkable day when God's people in God's land with God's king and God's temple were destroyed, taken away. They were all gone. And not only were they all gone, they were defeated by a pagan king. And the theme of Daniel, we're going to come back to this over and over, is that Yahweh is sovereign. Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. In the days of these kings, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these other kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So we go back to God is great, right? This is the kind of the theme phrase for this book. God is great, and so I don't have to fear other people. He's going to be in control. But so the question then becomes, how do we live faithfully as agents, ambassadors of that kingdom in a world, an empire that is increasingly more and more like Babylon? It can be overwhelming at times. And we keep coming to this thought of who then is in power versus who is in control. Because we said last week, it's not the same thing. Because there are certain people in power, but they're not the ones in control. The bottom line in this book and through the rest of Scripture, but specifically in this book, is that God is the one who is in control. So we continued that in verses 3 through 4, the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both the royal family, the nobility, the youths, without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. So again, we have these young boys, 13 to 14 years old. Their voices are still changing. They have all of a sudden are taken away from their families, taken away from any authority that they know, and they're given access to the best food, the best of everything, and asked to just merely be obedient and to learn the ways of the Babylonians. So these young boys, again, away from anybody who can tell them yes or no, are being asked to become Babylonian, to be indoctrinated, to be one of them, and to be representatives, even though they look Jewish because they're captives. This was the trophy. They were the trophies of the king and the empire. Look at all these different people from all over the world, and yet they all love the king. They all support the king's policies. They all speak our language. They all look at how benevolent and peaceful I think in much later centuries we'd call it the Pax Romanum, and this time the Pax Babylonian. It would be the peace of the Babylonian Empire, what wisdom and peace that the emperor would bring. So it says in verse 6, among these men were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Again, all of their names had been changed because the name of God was in all of them. And you can't have that because it's a constant reminder that there's this other God out there, and they didn't want to do that, so they changed all their names. Verse 7 says, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, who is like Shach, and Azariah he called Abednego. I think it's funny that Shack is the love goddess, so it's the love shack kind of thing there. So I just think that's funny. So their new names then are a reminder that a reminder to us that the world is always going to try and redefine you, reshape you, make you into their image. So they tried brainwashing these young men, tried changing their names, tried changing the way they think, and tried to make them think like Babylonians. And so the question is, did it work? And that's what we're going to talk about today, beginning in verse 7. Although I want to go back to verse 5 to start out with. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. And then skip down, that's where we covered last week, which we knew that, but this picks up in verse 8 when he says, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs, remember we learned his name is Ashpenaz earlier, to allow him not to defile himself. It struck me what it would be like. I think this pictures it. If you're Ashpenaz, the guy with the beard, and these 3 young punks from some defeated country come up and say to the king's buffet, do you have any good food? Anything that not only good food, something that won't defile us. I mean, it feels very much like Paris Hilton or somebody walking up and saying, this isn't good enough for me. Can you get me something better? When it's the king's table. And so you got to wonder what this guy was, what the heck are you talking about? This is, anybody in this room outside this room would die for access to this table. Again, these teenage boys away from home, away from everything. What is so important that you would be willing to risk really your life for at that point? Remember, again, the Judeans are in this position because they had not been kept up their part of the covenant. They had been eating non-kosher foods. They had been living in non-kosher ways and stuff like that. They had not been living wholly separate lives when they were in their own kingdom. And so now they're here, and some of them are really trying to change and prove that they deserve to have their kingdom back. They're trying to prove to God that they are they deserve to go back again. You can take us home. We learned our lesson, basically. And this will become embedded in their culture so much so that that's why we understand the Pharisees to be so legalistic. They were legalistic because they wanted to go home and they didn't want to get kicked out again. It's very similar in the time when the Puritans were coming over to settle in Massachusetts. They're 6 weeks away from any authority that can help them. If they've got, as far as they're concerned, these wild savages that are outside going to kill them. And if they don't have help, their only help is God. And if they don't live according to his covenant, then he's not going to help them and he's going to let them get wiped out. Several other colonies had already been wiped out. So they lived according to a very Jewish style covenant. They lived according to the lifestyle. They would stone people. They did a lot of stuff that was Old Testament because they were trying to do the same thing. If we don't do it, God's not going to let us stay in this land. And that's kind of what's happening here. Again, of course, in the future, they're going to be very legalistic. And these are the very kinds of thinking that Jesus confronts as they become legalists. But about the food, what is it about the food that these young boys thought would defile them? It's not because there was curry in the food. It's not because it was cooked differently. It was, they'd agreed to serve a foreign king. They agreed to take on a foreign name. They agreed to live in a foreign land, but for some reason they had a problem with the food. And none of the other things are forbidden in Scripture, but there was, as a part of the covenant, the highlight of the covenant was the food laws and how they were supposed to live in what we would now call a kosher style of eating. So eating kosher separated and continues to separate the Jews from the rest of the world. You go to a McDonald's in Israel, you can get a hamburger and you can get a milkshake, but they're in 2 separate buildings. You cannot, and they're both McDonald's buildings, because you cannot have milk and meat in the same place. You can have a vegetarian pizza, but you cannot have a pizza with pepperoni or salami on it or ham, and you can't do that. Or you can have with one without cheese, but you can't do at the same time. So they continued to live according to kosher laws. Eating kosher separated them and created that separateness, again, is that holiness that sets them apart. Now, again, you can understand that to be the way that we're living to be in obedience, or you can understand that to be, this is the way we live to be holy. This is not a spiritual, that's the mistake if you believe that. And it's not meant to make them more godlike, but it distinguishes them as followers of Yahweh. So if they eat like everybody else, no one's going to know that they are a separate and unique people. The meats that were at the king's table were not kosher. So clearly they were not able to do that. In addition to that, it says they weren't able to drink the wine. Well, wine was not part of the kosher law. They're able to eat wine. So why weren't they allowed to drink the wine? The wine and the meat, all of that came from the altars. They were all foods that were offered at the altars of their gods. And so all of this stuff, there was no alternative to them but to eat vegetarian, water and vegetables. That was the only thing that they could eat that would, they're not trying to eat kosher, or they're not, this is not what we're being told that they're eating is not kosher. That's not a definition of what it means to be kosher, but it's the only thing that they could eat that would fit within kosher law. Does that make sense? So it's, I guess what I want to say is, Daniel didn't have a science book that said, if I eat this way, I'm going to be healthier. And he didn't have any kind of proof or books or anything like that to say this is a better way of eating, but especially to make him fatter and look healthier. But he trusted that if he was obedient, that God would bless his obedience. And so this separation or this holiness is about obedience. It's not about legalism. So verse 9 says, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief eunuchs. Underline God gave, because that's going to repeat itself over and over here. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief eunuchs. Favor and compassion were not a result of what they did. It was obedience. It was because of the fact that God gave favor and compassion for Daniel to the chief of the eunuchs because of their obedience. The favor didn't, oh, these are good kids. They're living obedience. I should have favor on them. No, God gave. The reason that favor came was because God decided that God appointed for that to happen. So the good news is that since it is God who gave, it is God who continues to give even to us today. Because remember, his name is Yahweh, the God who always was and always will be the same. So if he gave Daniel favor for his obedience, he can also give us favor and compassion in the sight of other people in our lives. Verse 10 says, and the chief of the eunuchs, this is the fourth time it says the chief of the eunuchs. And whenever things are, I find it fascinating. And we know his name is Ashpenaz. We don't know the name of the chief steward. We don't know the name, but we know the name of this guy. Somehow I think this guy is impacted by these young men in such a way he becomes a follower of Yahweh, and God honors him that way by memorializing his name in this book. Just a personal belief, but God doesn't do anything on accident. So I wonder why, he would be mentioned here so many times. And he says to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. So if something happens, if this goes sideways, his life is at stake. And so Daniel trusts that and believes in that. And so his request would make him responsible for his wealth. So Daniel, verse 11, says to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, it goes back to using their Hebrew names. He respects Ashpenaz enough that he's not going to make him responsible for what's about to happen. He goes to the next guy in charge, which is the guy, the steward over the food, and asks him to do that. And but he's so convinced that this can't happen. We cannot eat this defiled food, so we have to do something. And you imagine this has got to happen pretty quickly, because once he's in the palace, that's the only access he has. And you can only go a certain amount of days without eating anything before this becomes a problem. So this is all happening pretty quickly. Verse 12, he says to the steward, test your servants for 10 days and let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And again, this is not what a kosher meal is. Kosher isn't an option. This is the only thing at the table that will fit a kosher standard. It's the next best thing for them is to be vegetarian. But only drinking water is, again, shows us that it's not about kosher rules, because there's nothing anti-kosher about drinking wine. It's the fact that this wine and the food was offered at the altar of their idols. And again, it's interesting because this has become a diet, Daniel's diet. We've all heard Daniel's diet, and it's not a prescribed diet in Scripture. This is a particular situation that was happening, and the only response they had in order to be faithful was to live as eating vegetables and drinking water. I think he'd actually call that vegan, right? It's not even vegetarian, it's vegan at that point. So verse 13 says, and then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So we listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. They weren't being blessed again because of their diet. They were being blessed because of their obedience. And that's what set them apart. Verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave, there's that God gave again, highlight that again, because we're being reminded again of who's in charge. He may not be in power, but he's the one who's in charge. He gave them learning and skill in literature and wisdom. And Daniel had the understanding of all visions and dreams. Only Daniel can interpret dreams and visions. Again, their success was not because of their diet. It was because God gave. Verse 2 says, Yahweh gave the Judeans over to Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one that was in charge of the captivity in the first place. Verse 9, God gave favor to the boys, to the officials. Verse 17, again, right here, it says God gave them gifts and skills of wisdom and learning, and Daniel had visions. So Yahweh is the source. He is the one who is sovereign in this situation. And this is going to be the way the rest of this book operates. These young men, for the next, and it'll tell you in just a moment, for the next 70 years, are going to live in a way that is set apart and unique and holy to God so that he could use them again. And they will depend on Yahweh to give them the things that they need and to provide for them as they make the choice to live for him. So God gave, which is again a statement that he is in control, even in Babylon. Even in Babylon, God is in control. As far away, because that was one of the questions. We're not in Judea anymore. Does he have power, or are these gods more powerful than he is while he's here? Daniel chapter 1, verse 18. At the end of the time, remember they were there for 3 years. These young men are now 16 to 17 years old. They look like Jews, but they're taught again to think and to act like Babylonians. They were trophies again of this conquered king. They were able to complete their 3 years of training in an evil empire, and yet in the midst of it, still remain faithful to the covenant that God had called them to. I think that's pretty amazing. Young men. When the king commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs, again, Ashpenaz, I think we should, one, it's a cool name to say. It's a cool word. Ashpenaz. But when I was little, our friends that used to live next door, they had lived in Washington State, and there was this town that I loved to hear him say, Wishka. So I'd always say it again, Wishka. Ashkenaz is like one of those names. It just feels kind of good to say. So not only that, but for some reason, again, God included it, and I think I just want to honor Ashkenaz for whatever it is, the reason that God decided to honor him. I want to make sure we're doing that. The chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar, and again, the Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor, and the king spoke with them and among all of them. So he's walking through this crowd of young men, Jewish men, kids from Egypt, kids from Assyria, kids from Iraq, Medes and Persians, and all these other empires that they'd been conquering, tribes that they've been conquering. And he's talking to them, asking them questions. I think it's a fascinating picture when it says specifically, not only did he speak to them, but it says he went among all of them. And they're all there. None was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king. And it's interesting that he was looking for something among this crowd of young boys that set them apart, to make them holy in his eyes. And yet God had already seen the holiness in these four young men specifically that was different from the whole crowd. So there's two kinds of holiness that are happening. One that, and in both cases, these four young men are recognized as being unusual. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. I don't think there was an actual measurement of like you're 8 times better, you're 10. I just think this is one of those what do you call it when you're just superbly, right? Hyperbole. Yes, when you are overstating it to the fact that like these guys were like above and they stood out. They were holy compared to these other people. And it was not only to the other young men that were there, but it says in compared to all the other magicians and enchanters that were in his entire kingdom. They really stood out. Not a little, but way above. They were exceptional. Again, they were set apart. They were holy in the way. And verse 21 says, and Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. We compare that to chapter 1, verse 1. The first year of King Cyrus is about 70 years later. Yeah. And so this book is going to recount the rest of his life. So for 70 years, they lived in faithfulness in this way. That they lived separate. Right? What's that?
There's quite a few kings in
4 kings and 2 empires.
But they must have had term limits or something, because some of them were really short.
Well, the term limits was called the death sentence. Yeah, they had terminal limits. Yeah. Yeah, and I think the most fascinating thing beyond that is it was 2 empires. Because as the empire switched and the capital seat actually changes, somehow Daniel continues to move with that. And that's, again, a God-gave moment that Yahweh provides for that to happen. So we watch that happen with Joseph in the Old Testament, but that's not a change of emperors. That's a change or kingdoms. That's a very different, unique thing. So I'm very convicted by this young guy. And I wanted to have, it's an AI-generated picture of him. I wanted to have a picture of him just so that we can kind of get in our mind. This is a young, he's a real guy, and I'm convicted by his lifestyle. And again, the good news is that because God gave him favor, compassion, all the other things that God continued to give, wisdom and all those other things, Yahweh still continues to give to us today. He will give to us. He is in control in our Babylons, our own personal Babylons. And he's in control in your Babylon. He still gives wisdom and authority and understanding, even in the midst of an ungodly culture, as we think of leading up to this election, the things that are going to happen. He is asking still in the midst of the Babylon that we live in, that we live holy and separate, that we're supposed to be unique. The way that we comport ourselves should be different than the way the world does in the midst of all of this. If we don't have kosher laws, then how are we supposed to be different? What are the things that distinguish us? Well, by the way that we love one another as one, right? Jesus said, that's the way the world will know that you're my followers, by the love that you have for one another. By caring for the least, the last, and the lost. Take care of these, when did we do that? You took care of them. By our character, by our integrity, by our love for our neighbors, by our love for God, by the greatest commandments. Love your neighbor as yourself and love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. By the lives that we live that are unique, so that when our neighbor kids that have dropped in our house and spent the night and stolen food out of our refrigerators, 10 years later finally hit the bottom and they're like, what just happened in my life? The only place they know of safety and security are people that follow Jesus. That's how we do it. That's how it's meant to be done. Romans chapter 12 says, I appeal to you, therefore, my brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. here's the thing. This verse, I think, talks so much about Daniel. Daniel wasn't eating the food because it was offered to idols, but by doing so, he was offering himself as an act of worship on the altar to God. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So, Holy Spirit, teach us. Where are we walking along with the ways of the world and just doing it because the world does it? We are not captives in Babylon, but we live in a Babylonian culture, for sure. I hate to say that. But they were not the only Jewish boys. What happened to all that? We don't hear about any, we only hear about four of them. There was the whole royal family, all their kids were taken. And you have all these other, what happened to the rest of them? They forgot their identity and they gave in, like we mentioned last week, to the opulence and the goodness of all that was around them. And I think this is the biggest problem in the American church today is we have forgotten our identity. And because we have forgotten our identity, we can't teach the next generation to come up and who they are and how to make better choices. So we need to live holy lives. And that's the call of Daniel to each of us this morning. Father, thank you. We know there's lists, we know there's things that we can do, but those lists are not meant to be measures of righteousness. The measure of righteousness is obedience to your word. If you love me, keep my commandments. Father, teach us today how we might be more obedient to you. Give us courage to be obedient to you. Help us to be holy.